Philippians chapter 4 and verse 11. Not that I speak in respect of want, but I learn whatsoever I am therewith to be content. As we have seen often making our way through this epistle, there was an especially close bond between the Apostle Paul and the church of Philippi. It was his first venture into the European continent, and the church itself seems to have been a singularly attractive church. And it seems to have been very consistent in its affection for the apostle. And it had shown that affection in many different ways, one of which the apostle refers to in the verse just before this. Their care of him, he tells us in verse 10, had flourished again. And this is a reminder to us that Paul at this time was imprisoned in Rome, and the church at Philippi had made strenuous efforts to help the apostle in that predicament. And they had especially to help him financially. And they may have done so either to secure some necessary comforts for the apostle in his imprisonment, or perhaps to meet some of the costs involved in Paul's trial. In any case, they had been very generous. And Paul is in this part of the epistle expressing his thankfulness to them for their care with respect to his welfare. And he thanks them very sincerely. And yet he also does so very, very carefully and very, very tactfully, because for the apostle there is more at stake than simply thanking those who are given him money. And he wants, above all, to make plain to them that his peace of mind, his emotional well-being, did not at all depend on his comfort or on his financial circumstances. And he tells them that he is sincerely grateful for the kindness that they have shown. And yet he also tells them that they must keep in perspective the wants that he had known and the way that he had reacted himself personally to those particular wants. And he tells them, it isn't so much for my own sake and for the difference to my own condition. It isn't for that reason that I am so thankful for the money. It is because it speaks so well and speaks so eloquently of your own spiritual condition. It speaks so finely of your love and care and of your brotherly concern. Because he says, for myself, I cannot speak of need, and I'm not complaining of need, because I have learned, in whatever condition I find myself, I have learned to be content with that condition. Now it is a great statement that shows us one of the great possibilities of our Christian lives. that we may, by the grace of God, attain ourselves personally to this particular situation, a condition where, whatever our circumstances, we are not complaining, we are not envious, we are content. And I want to look this morning briefly at some of the emphases that are involved in Paul's teaching at this point. Let us ask ourselves, first of all, what the apostle means with contentment. I have learned to be content. But what is this grace? What is it to be content? Now, the primary meaning of this word that Paul uses here is to be independent of one's circumstances. It was used by the Stoic philosophers as a term that meant for them self-sufficiency. It meant that a man didn't depend on his environment, didn't depend on his condition. He had something in himself that left him sufficient as of himself and left him independent of a situation in which he found himself. Now, I don't want to import into my teaching this morning the whole of that stoical emphasis, because the Apostle Paul was no Stoic. But it is the primary drift of the teaching that a Christian can be at peace in himself, and at peace with himself, and at peace with the world, and at peace with God, no matter what his situation, no matter what his circumstances. Paul is speaking of his emotional condition, and he is telling us that he felt peace, and he felt joy, and he felt fulfilled, he felt integrated. He was able to feel these things no matter what his situation. And he states it absolutely categorically and with no qualification whatsoever. In whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. There is, he says, no external situation. There is no set of possibilities. There are no conceivable circumstances in which I would not be content. There is nothing whatsoever in the objective and external world that could possibly take my peace of mind from me. I have learned to be independent emotionally of my circumstances. And I have learned the lesson so effectively that I am independent of my circumstances, whatever they might be. Now, that is the great generalization. But then you see the apostle can particularize them too. If we go through the kind of life that Paul had led. Let's remember, for example, the incidents of Acts chapter 16, which we read. In this very same city of Philippi, the apostles are unjustly arrested, and they are cast into prison, into the very depths of the prison. Their feet are fast in the stocks. And yet, despite all the horror and all the uncertainty of that situation, you remember how at midnight Paul and Silas are praying and singing praises to God. Now that illustrates the situation perfectly. because their circumstances are so adverse. And yet their emotional condition bears no relation at all to their actual providential situation. It isn't the prison that determines how they feel. It isn't the darkness. It isn't the injustice. It isn't the uncertainty. It isn't the stocks. It is none of these things that determines the way that these people feel. Their feelings, their frame of mind is altogether independent of their objective situation. Now it's the same with this Roman imprisonment. It is an imprisonment of tremendous rigor and hardship. It is one of great inconvenience and discomfort, one of uncertainty, one of injustice. It is one from which Paul has no certainty that he will ever emerge alive. He contemplates in the first chapter the possibility that his end is near, and that very soon he will seal his testimony as an apostle with his very blood. And yet, in that situation, the apostle is content. His imprisonment is not what governs his emotional situation. And you go right through the apostle's life. How often he tells us he has been abased, disinherited by his parents at the moment of his commitment to Jesus Christ, persecuted by the Jews, the cares of all the churches, the hostility of so many Christians, the contempt of so many Christians, the scorn and the ridicule of the false prophets and apostles. And still the apostle is content. Take him in all the hardship that he endured on his missionary journeys. And yet still these things are not to roll, he says, the way that he feels. His peace of mind, his sense of fulfillment, his assurance, these are all utterly independent of his own objective situation. Now surely this morning we can apply that to ourselves, because it is laid down here as a great principle that the Christian is a contented man. That again is normative Christianity. That we have no right before God to be discontented. And that if we feel this morning discontent, then we are sinning against God. We are sinning against our whole Christian position. It is a sin for a believer not to be content. It is as sinful as to hate one's brother. It is as sinful as to be judging people. It is as sinful as to be anxious and worried. We have no right before God to be discontented. Discontented because of our situation. That is utterly wrong for the believer. But then you see what we do. We say to each other, yes, but if you knew my situation, and if you knew my problems, if you knew my circumstances, then you would realize why I'm discontented. And you would realize that I have every right to be discontented. Now, if I understand this passage correctly, it is saying to us that there is no situation, there are no circumstances, there is no combination of circumstances which can ever justify the child of God being discontented. It is holding out to us this great possibility that by the grace of God no matter how appallingly different our outward circumstances may be, that still we are bound to be content, and by God's grace we are able to be content. We have no right not to, and we can never plead the circumstances as justification for our discontent. Now, can I really ask that question? Can I ask it of myself? Do I really think that no matter how Paul felt and no matter what Paul teaches, that there is something so different and something so unique in my situation that I am exempt from this principle, or I am beyond the scope of this marvelous providence, this marvelous promise? And am I saying to myself that if Paul knew my difficulties, if Paul knew my circumstances, then Paul would understand and Paul would condone? And I would suggest that we are taught by this passage that no matter what our inheritance has been, no matter what our temperament has been, no matter what our circumstances have been, we have no right to be discontented. And moreover, that no matter what our circumstances are, we are not beyond the scope of this great promise that God can give us this kind of frame of mind. Now then, I would qualify that in certain directions. There is the great principle that whatever our circumstances, we are bound to be content. And that whatever our circumstances, God is able to give us the grace of contentment. And yet, I would qualify it in certain directions. Now, in what directions? I'm not modifying the principle at all, but I want to guard it against some possible misunderstandings. And what are these? Well, I think first of all this. It does not mean that there were no times in Paul's life when he felt utterly dejected. In other words, I'm saying this. And I don't think that the Apostle Paul personally was always in this condition. I think that he too stood under the principle, and that he ought to have been always content. And I think too that by God's grace he could have been always content. But we see the apostle as a Christian in a state of grace, and we see him as we see ourselves falling into despondency, into depression. Now, I don't speak perhaps of Paul's ever falling into discontent specifically in that actual term, because this word only occurs twice in the New Testament, this word and its related words. But we find the man who was able to say at this juncture in his life, towards the end of his life or latish in his life, this man could then say that he was always content. But we know that this man sometimes fell like yourselves into despondency. We know that sometimes, as he tells the church at Corinth, he was pressed beyond measure, that he despaired even of life, and that his outward man perished. We know that when the thorn of the flesh came, Paul found that very difficult to bear. Now, I want to say two things. I want to say this is the greatest possibility facing us as Christians, that we can be independent of circumstances. And I'm saying that's the way God wants us to be. And that's what by God's promise we can. But I don't want those who don't feel this way to go away and to say to themselves, we're no Christians because we're not like Paul. Because there were days when Paul, judged by his own standards, failed. And that seems to me immeasurably important. It seems to me absolutely superb that Paul cried to be rid of the thorn in the flesh. It is sublime that Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane asked God to remove the cup from them, because it reminds us of God's tolerance of this frame of mind, that we ourselves are so inclined of our being pressed beyond measure, of our moving down into despondence, of our moving close, as Paul says in one occasion, moving even into despair. Lord, from the depths to thee I cry. That is an interesting problem that may buzz about our minds as we reflect upon these great words, whether or not a man can be in the depths and be content. At the same time, I wouldn't at all rule that out. But for the moment I'm concerned with this, that the apostle said this was the great principle by which he lived, was not always able to live according to this principle, any more than you and I. And that there were times when he too was in depths, when he too was depressed, when he too was sad and despondent. And that surely is something of some comfort for ourselves. Again, I would make this qualification, that Paul's contentment did not extend to a quiet and passive acceptance of his own moral and spiritual condition. Paul looked at his own life. And as he looked at it, Paul said, I cannot condone it, I cannot approve. That which I do, I know not. That which I do, I don't like. I can't approve, I can't condone. And he said, oh, wretched man that I am. But Paul was not content with his spiritual condition. He was not content with the way that he lived. He was not content with that which I do. He wasn't content with his lifestyle. He wasn't content with the fruit that he bore, with the consistency he showed. He wasn't content with his growth and regress. He wasn't content at all with his own progress and holiness. He tells us so in Philippian church, and not as though I were already perfect. And Paul's acquiescence in his condition is an acquiescence in his circumstances, in his economic circumstances, in his physical circumstances, in his providential situation. It is not at all an acquiescence in the whole of life as it is. It isn't an acquiescence in his own moral and spiritual condition, because Paul was profoundly discontent with the way that he was. I would suggest again that we as Christians must follow that we can follow that we are not going to acquiesce in our own present stage of spiritual attainment, in our present rate of moral and spiritual progress. We are not content with that. I will make a third qualification too, and it is this. He was not prepared to acquiesce simply in all that he saw in the Christian church around. Paul loved these brethren. Paul tolerated the false prophets and the false apostles. And yet, Paul was not content as he looked at the church. As Paul looked at the Galatian church, and Paul looked at the Corinthian church, and Paul looked at these false teachers in Rome who preached Christ out of envy and out of divisiveness, Paul did not say, well, I have learned to be content, and I turn a blind eye to all the aberrations and all the abuses and all the inconsistencies in the church of God. Now this is something which I think is tremendously painful. Because we have to live, some of us, on this particular night bridge. On the one hand, under the pressure of this great principle of being content, which suggests that you accept things as they are. And at the same time, the principle that we are to do all in our power to reform and to revive the Church of the living God. And there was a great deal in the church, in the churches as Paul saw, with which he was not content, and in which he would not acquiesce. And I think there is a danger of arresting this principle of contentment, and of its becoming in our hands, as a result of its being rested, a principle of inertia. The Christian church is full of bishops and preachers, of elders and deacons, who are simply content to acquiesce in the situation as it is. And who might even allege this great principle: why get disturbed? Why get involved? Why not simply turn a blind eye? Why not be content with the church as it is? And I don't think that we have any right to rest the principle in this way. Paul didn't mind being persecuted. Paul didn't mind being hungry and cold and naked and in pain and discomfort. But Paul minded with every fiber in his body every heresy, every error, every inconsistency, every injustice in the church of the living God. And he would never acquiesce in any of these. And I would suggest that no matter how perfect a church may be, a particular church, that we ourselves have no right either to acquiesce. And I would suggest that when the day comes when we can simply acquiesce in the church as it is, in the church worldwide, simply acquiesce in our own denomination's condition, in my local church's condition, that then it's time to go. That the moment we are content to be tolerant there, then the time has come. Just as with ourselves. The day that I say of myself I am perfect, that day I'm done. And the day that I say of any church, denomination, congregation, it's a perfect church, that day too I'm done. When I acquiesce simply and passively in my own condition spiritually, then I'm done. When I acquiesce simply in my church's condition, then I'm done. I'm spent, I'm useless. I am then a cumberer of the ground. And Paul is saying to us, whatever our outward circumstances may be, let not these determine the way that we feel. Our poverties, our disappointments, our family problems, our bereavements or sorrows. We can speak so easily and so mincingly and so uninvolvedly of these, and yet they're so immensely painful. And yet, no matter what they are, no matter their frequency, no matter their intensity, no matter their complications, that however and whenever they come, they must not take from us our peace of mind. But that does not mean that we are simply to accept our own condition spiritually, or simply accept the church's condition spiritually, or even simply to accept the injustices and the inequities of the society around us. Our contentment must never become an inertia in terms of self-criticism, in terms of criticism of the church, in terms of criticism of the world in which we find ourselves. And I think that we must maintain these two great emphasis in all our teaching, that the Christian, that we ourselves are content with our external situation, And yet that must never take away from us the dynamism that wants to change. The Christian must never lose the determination to change. He is a person who is going to change the world. Now, the day that I lose that, I'm done for. And many a day I have almost lost it. Because it is so difficult to change things. Difficult to change oneself. And yet the day we give in, we have done for. And I must stand before the deficiencies of my own personality. I must stand before the weaknesses and inconsistencies of God's church. I must stand before the inequities of society. And I must not accept them or acquiesce in them or be content with them. I must retain the determination by the grace of God to improve them and to conform them more closely to his will as made known to us in Holy Scripture. And then we ask ourselves this: if that is what contentment means, if those are the ways in which this teaching is to be qualified, then how do we get this contentment? How do we attain to this particular situation? Now, what can I say? I would say this: it was something that Paul learned. I have learned that's immensely important, because it reminds us of this. It wasn't a matter of temperament. You see, if you discuss the problem of wine with any Christian, they will say to you, he cannot help but it's his temperament. You discuss with him the problem of his discontentment, and he will say the same thing: it's my temperament. But Paul does not say to the Philippians, don't worry too much about me, because with my temperament I don't get discontent. It's not temperament. I am sure, as we look at Paul, that he was an absolute bundle of energy. I am sure that by temperament he was a forceful, driving, impatient, impulsive, irritable man. That was his temperament. But that was not the way he was when he wrote this epistle. Because it wasn't his temperament that determined the way that he felt. And we have to realize for ourselves the importance of that. That we cannot justify impatience, irritability, bad temper. We cannot justify depressiveness. We cannot justify anxiety. We cannot justify discontent. We cannot justify these by simply saying, that's my temperament. For one, my temperament is my temperament. It is a sin to have a particular temperament. It's a sin to have an anxious temperament. It's a sin to have a discontented temperament. It's a sin to have a depressive temperament. And what do I do with these temperaments? Do I simply take my temperament, my depressive temperament, my anxious temperament, my selfish temperament, my irritable, bad-tempered temperament, and acquiesce? No. I have to control them. I've got to alter them. Here again, there is the same necessary emphasis on change. You don't accept your temperament. I may be very lazy by temperament. I don't accept my temperament. And I would say that it is fundamental to the Christian life that you don't accept your temperament, that you get to grips with your temperament. Every one of us has personality problems. Every one of us has awkwardnesses in his temperament. And none of us has the right simply to accept it. We have to get to grips. We have to modify. We have to alter these temperaments. And Paul is saying that his contentment wasn't something he was born. I don't think he was born with that kind of temperament. But he had learned it. I would say again this: that when he says that he had learned, he does not mean either that in one great moment, all his impatience and all his anxiety and all his discontent, that all these have been overcome. That is another great error that occurs which we fall into today. Some say this is a matter of temperament, and others say it's a matter of a momentary experience and in a moment of a conversion to Christ. All that goes away. Well, would that that were so. But I cannot this morning say that no man is a Christian that is not content. I cannot say that it is given to us in conversion that all these problems go away. And I am sure that for many years after his conversion, Paul didn't have this condition. And Paul wasn't living at this level. It wasn't given to him in one great, easy experience. No doubt these things sometimes happen, that people lose their cravings for particular sins, for alcohol or for nicotine or what have you. But sometimes the bondage is completely broken in the moment of conversion. But I don't think that is what Paul is saying here. And I don't think it commonly happens that people's temperamental infirmities are overcome in one great single easy moment. It was something learned through the long discipline of a Christian life. What I mean by that is this. Paul had been taught by God out of the Word of God that contentment was a duty. He had learned that. He had learned it. Now I think that's singularly important. Because I would ask you this morning, when did you learn that contentment was a duty? I would ask you, how do you realize that discontent is a sin? And I think that very often we fall into these errors and these almost morbid spiritual conditions because we don't realize that they're sins at all. And the first thing we've got to learn is that this is God's will, that it is a sin to be discontented, that it is God's imperative that we be content. And that's what Paul had learned. And Paul had also learned that it was a possibility. It was a duty. It was a possibility. It could be done. He could be content in whatever state he was. He had learned that. And he had learned more. God had shown him how. He had learned that it was his duty. He had learned that it was a possibility. He had learned how it might be attained, how it might be secured. And perhaps I can indicate very briefly how it's going to be attained, and how it was possible for the apostle. Indicate how we had learned contentment, and indicate how we ourselves can discipline ourselves in contentment. How can we do it? I think first of all, if we take our stand initially on this great principle, thy will be done. I think that's where contentment begins. The commitment of our hearts to that very simple principle. What I want is the will of God. And so long as I know it's God's will, I won't quarrel. And there is no way that we as Christians can say, to do thy will I take delight. There is no way that we can do and say that, and then all of a sudden when God gives us his will, we're in all kinds of trouble. We're upset, we're annoyed with God. I know this morning that theologically it is the clearest of principles. I know that in the pulpit it is an easy point to make. I know that way down in the valley of the shadow of death it is immensely difficult. But I know that there is no other way. my heart's commitment, my emotional loyalty to that. What I want is the will of God. And that's very often why we're not content. Because we don't like God's will. Because we don't really want God's will. We want to run. Now I was suggest that if we alter our perspectives, if we stand on that principle, thy will be done, we would learn many things. We would know that each day we rise, we have nothing but God's will. Nothing can rid us of the providence of God. We have nothing but the cup which God has filled to overflow. This is the day which the Lord has made. You see the marvel in that. Each day I rise, I've got God's will. Each day I have the cup which is given. Each day I have the day which the Lord has made. And I've got to try. When there are tremendous emotional currents running all around me, and when all my friends are disoriented in their unbelief, and the agony and emptiness of my own providence very often, in desolation and bereavement, can I lay hold of it? It's God's will, it's God's cup, it's the Father's heart. I've got to try and keep myself there. It's the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad. O Lord, bless thy word to us and apply to our souls and make it strong and relevant, make it strengthening and upbuilding, make it transforming and energizing, make it fruitful. May it be a word that changes us, a word that administers contentment, no matter what our situation is, and a word that nourishes our discontent with what we ourselves, with what the church is, and with what the world is. Help us, O Lord, to learn, and help us to make it our primary concern that thy will should be done. And whenever we see that will being done, to be content. Help us to covet not things on earth, but those unseen and eternal things which are in heaven. And help us, O Lord, to come to be in Christ, and help us being in him to abide. Take from us all our sin. In his name, amen. We shall close by singing Psalm 16, and from verse 5, and we shall sing to the end of the psalm. Psalm 16 at verse 5, we shall sing the 7 last stanzas, Gum inheritance and cup the portion, to the end of the psalm to God's church.